Welcome to another edition of Latino Paradox. With me is Ruben Navarrette, the Syndicated Columnist, and I'm Arnold, Torres, a political analyst. And we really try to talk about topics that are always underneath the surface at times and very much on the surface. And we wanted to talk about a topic that we think is very, very important because it goes to the heart of where this country finds itself in today. And that is about the American experiment. The experiment about democracy. The Atlantic Monthly, Ruben, wrote an interesting piece that talked about the American idea in 1850 was crystallized by Theodore Parker, who said that all three elements of the American idea: all people are created equal, all possess unalienable rights, and that all should have the opportunity to develop and enjoy those rights. And they are going to be secured by a government of all the people, by all the people, for all the people. That's the experiment, right? That's been where we've been at. But that doesn't seem to be what we're seeing in this nation today or throughout the world. How and why did we get to this situation, Ruben, if you agree about this experiment, possibly experiment being doomed, that we're never going to realize?
So the three principles you laid out are equality, rights, and opportunity. And it seems to me that those are always the ideals to aspire to, but you're never going to get there. Not in our lifetime, not in our children's lifetime. It's always an ideal. It's an unattainable ideal that you're always going to get, say, for instance, perfect equality. You can have vast inequality that we've seen in our lifetime and in our country's lifetime between African Americans and white Americans in the South and others. You've had vast amounts of inequality under law, and you can have, likewise curtailment of certain rights and a constant battle of rights.
But Ruben, do you think that
and also an opportunity? I'm sorry, just an opportunity. The third one, you can also see people confusing equal opportunity with equal outcome. So they have the opportunity, but not the outcome. Go ahead.
But do you think that experiment is doomed? You think that it's pretty much not worth pursuing anymore, or that it's not going to be pursued anymore?
I don't agree that's doomed. I think it is always worth pursuing. I think it's never attainable. What people confuse is the idea that we haven't attained it was somehow it was a failed experiment or it was doomed to begin with. It's a element of perfection that you're never going to quite get to. You're never going to have complete equality, even among the races and other people, because you have income differentials. You have people entering the job market, graduating from the same college. One person gets a job because of their father. One person's dad is a mailman or a cop or whatever, and they can't hook you up that way. There's always going to be basic inequalities. So I see it this way. I see like the American ideal is something that's, first, it's the best thing we have going. It's preferable to any other country I can think of around the world. Certainly, it deals with multiculturalism, immigration issues much better than other countries do around the world for all our problems. And so I think it's constantly an attainable thing. It's like trying to achieve perfect good health. You want to go. You don't want to just give up and say you can't do it, but you're fooling yourself if you think you can ever be completely 100% healthy. It's going to be a constant battle and a constant thing. And likewise, that's been the American story. So I don't believe with the conclusion drawn in the Atlantic article that the experiment is doomed, because I think the experiment it's like the saying, the process isn't the destination, it's the journey. The journey is what matters, not the destination. We keep focused on the destination and we say, oh, well, because we haven't achieved nirvana, it's failed. It was never supposed to be about that.
I think we've gotten to a point where the idea is moving more in the negative direction than in the positive direction. And I believe that, as you said, I don't know if the idea was ever attaining perfection. I think, obviously, it's impossible to ever be perfect about anything. But I think the founding drafters and the founders who pushed this experiment and idea of democracy in the manner that we have didn't anticipate the diversity that we would have, did not anticipate many of the things that of the obstacles that we've had in front of us. And I think that failure to anticipate has really gotten us to where we're at, because we're no longer following principles. we're actually deviating from those principles. We're detaching ourselves from the principles of those three things. We're beginning to believe that not all of those things should apply to everyone. Not all of these things, that America isn't the country that really should be talking about that to the rest of the world. So I think the American idea and the experiment in the minds of some is finished. And I think that it's such a fragile idea and experiment. It's almost like in the movie Gladiator, where he says Rome was just a whisper. The idea of what Rome could be was just a whisper. As soon as you said it, it was gone. And I think that that's where we're at with the American experiment. Now, the major question, Ruben, is what does that idea of American idea and it being doomed or not doomed, how does that fit into the Latino paradox?
So I think there's a divide in the Latino community, as there is in many communities, along class differences, along the elites. On the one hand, I would define as the elites people who, let's say you're a university president and you're Hispanic, you're Latino. You had humble upbringings. Your parents and grandparents may have come from the fields, but the fact is you're a university president. You start your day reading The Atlantic and Vanity Fair and reading the New York Times. You listen to NPR. You bring people to speak, and they're always the David Brookses and the people from the New York Times written books and the like. That is the world in which you operate, the ideal world. But you're Latino. And at the end of the day, you fall into the Latino community. Your life is completely different than a first-generation Latino farm worker who is working hard so their kids can go to Yale or Stanford or Harvard or wherever. For the first one, the university president, he's free to play with this Atlantic article and say, well, maybe they're right. Maybe the experiment is doomed. Maybe blah, blah, blah. But for the farm worker who's sending their kid to Yale or Harvard, the American dream is very much alive. The American experiment is working perfectly. Every generation is moving ahead. You know, you and I have a different perspective now at this point in our life than we may have had when we were young college students coming in and sort of breaking through. Once a generation breaks through and gets a chance to breathe rarefied air and have experiences that our parents and grandparents couldn't have dreamt of, we have the luxury of being able to sit back and say, maybe the American experiment has failed. But for people at the bottom, the experiment is working great. The dream is still working out. And to some degree, people like you and I have the luxury of being able to have that conversation that is just so foreign. It's so impractical and so illogical to people who are just breaking into the store and hoping to get a slice of the pie.
Well, I think you and I have a very, very significant disagreement, because if it isn't the person who you say is doing well in realizing that dream, which I disagree with you a great deal, if it isn't that person who has an understanding of the American experiment and the American idea, and is benefiting in part from some of those concepts and those principles, if they're not the ones that are going to give life to that idea and to that experiment, then you and I at the other end of the spectrum, that university president, is not going to be enough to give life and to give it replenishment and to give it strength. So for the Latino community, with our phenomenal growth politically,
you don't think they're giving it life at that level if they're putting their kids through college? And
there has to be a conscious life. They have to know how that it has to be nurtured. In other words, it isn't just nurtured by benefiting from it. It's by having to strengthen it. And right now, this country is in the throes of being at its weakest that it's ever been about these principles. And it is the Latino community, in my opinion, because of our demographic growth in this country, that if we are not the ones who are going to give it a revitalization, then I believe it is doomed. If we, as a community who have aspired to that experiment, who have sacrificed unbelievably to come to be a part of that experiment, if we're not the ones who are revitalizing it consciously, not subconsciously, but very, very consciously, then I believe it will be doomed. I wish we could continue the conversation. I think this goes to the heart of things that we ought to be dealing with. But our time is up. We hope that people will comment and call. And thank you again for joining us on an edition of Latino Paradox. Until the next time, thank you.
Thank you.